Well, I hope you enjoyed watching Alan and I's recent adventure on the infamous River Lot. As you could probably tell from watching the video, it was by no means easy, and it was without doubt one of the most challenging fishing experiences I've had to date. The River Lot itself is an absolute beast. It stretches over 300 miles in total, working its way through several regions of the south of France. The river itself is divided into different sections which are split by 17 locks. So as you can imagine, this created a challenge in itself, not only trying to locate some carp to fish for, but also navigating our way up and down the river. It was by no means easy, and just trying to catch a few carp proved quite a challenge. However, we did manage to catch a few during the course of the week, and this is how we went about doing it. Prior to our trip, I had little to no experience river fishing in general. You know, don't get me wrong, I grew up on the rivers in the UK fishing for other species such as chub, barbel, etc. But when it comes down to carp fishing on a river, let alone wild river in the south of France, I'll be lying if I said I wasn't slightly apprehensive. Thankfully, Alan had a little more experience than me, and I'll be completely honest, I don't know if I'd have been able to do it without him. But we both brought our different attributes to the table, and well, in the end, we got the job done. Each stretch was very different. Some stretches consisted of deeper, slower moving water. Some were narrower, fast flowing. So it was really a case of spending the first sort of day or so searching the river and trying to pick out some likely looking areas. To be honest with you, there was large parts of the river that you could pretty much write off straight away. You know, it's quite bland, quite straight. However, what we were looking for was areas where fish would be drawn to, you know, bends, slower moving eddies as such, snags being the obvious one, and weed. You know, there was surprisingly, some sections did contain weed. All of these things we were looking for, just natural areas where the carp like to hold up. So once we decided on a spot to fish as such, it was then a case of trying to tackle everything that the river throws at you, and the number one rule that we decided was presentation. It was all about being able to present for a long period of time. You know, the river is always throwing challenges at you, and the main one being the flow. We noticed throughout the duration of a week that the river could change literally in a heartbeat. 1 minute it could be slow moving with little to no pace, and just like that, a lock's opened or you get a bit of rain and the river could rise by 1-2 meters. So we had to take this into account. The first thing to do was actually find some spots that we could physically present a rig. Now we had to work as a team with this, one of us steering the boat and one of us trying to find these spots. Now we had a couple of tools, pieces of equipment with us that we discussed previous and we thought would be a real benefit to this trip. The most important one for me was the underwater camera. You could straight away tell by dropping the camera that some spots were just different from others. You know, some were pretty bland and boring with just sort of gravel runs as such. However, every now and again you would come across a special spot, and you could tell it had been fed on previous because there was a lot of broken shells, you know, a lot of naturals that are built up in this area. Clearly spots that have been fed on by fish. And those are the spots that we chose to target, primarily because we knew that carp had fed there in the past. And without the aid of the underwater camera, we just wouldn't have known. As well as the underwater camera, we also decided to take a pair of goggles. These also helped massively. Once we had chosen our spot and put the underwater camera down, we were then able to, if the sun was out and the depths were shallow enough, we were able to literally put our heads under the water and literally spend a few seconds scouting out the whole area. Again, this made a massive difference when placing our rods. Presenting a rig successfully was without doubt the hardest challenge of the trip, and it was most definitely a team effort. It wasn't just a case of picking a spot, casting a rod out or dropping a rig from a boat, bringing it back to our spot and you were done. The flow of the river and the nature of the beast meant that you couldn't have a direct line going through the river. It just would not have held bottom, even with 6, 8, 10 ounces of lead. So for that reason, we had to adopt the washing line tactic. Now, it's a tactic that I wasn't really too familiar with. It is used in the UK to an extent, but it is a common tactic used in Europe, especially on these large rivers. In simple terms, the washing line rig basically consists of you fishing your main line completely out of the water, directly to a snag or a tree, something where you can tie off to, meaning you can have a direct line going straight down onto your spot, and the rest of your main line back to your swim completely out of the water, which significantly reduces the chances of the flow being able to pick your main line up and moving your rig from the spot. The most commonly used thing to set up a washing line rig is basically a rubber band that you would tie off to a snag or a tree, and it allows you to basically place your main line within that rubber band, creating tension down to your rig. However, we quickly learned that as good as the rubber bands were, you couldn't adjust the tension. So that meant if there was a sudden increase in wind down the valley of the river, or a bird might fly through for whatever reason, the rubber band wouldn't be able to hold and it would detach from the snag and your rig would be dragged down the river. Thankfully, Alan brought with him what can only be described as it's like an adjustable line clip as such. I think they're used in catfishing more so than carp fishing. However, what this allowed us to do was adjust the tension that said clip was enforcing on the main line. So because of the flow of the river, battling our way back across the river, which was often really wide at times, was quite a challenge, you know, especially when holding a rod and trying to ensure that you weren't pulling the braid off the spot as such. So this line clip allowed us to adjust the tension, and after a bit of toing and throwing and a bit of practice, we managed to get it just about right. And for the majority of the session, our rigs were fishing at all times. We had no issues there. Getting the correct tension of the line clip was absolutely paramount. If it was too loose when you're coming back across the river, as I've already mentioned, you could easily dislodge it from the clip and you'd have to start the whole process again. Alternatively, if the tension was too much, when you were lucky enough to get a take, if the tension was too tight, the fish would then not be able to pull the braid away from the clip, and in effect, you wouldn't get any indication on the rod end. So when fishing the washing line, it's paramount to create as much tension as possible. As you can imagine, with your line out of the water, indication at times can be poor. So we'd crank the rods down as tight as we dare without dislodging the main line from the line clip. These were locked into place on our pods back on the boat with our butt locket streams. These were absolute must. If we didn't have these, the chances are we would have lost several rods on the take. The actual bites themselves, because of the tension, 9 times out of 10, it would be a complete drop back of a bite. So when the fish picks up your hook bait and moves off, it then dislodges the line from the line clip, creating a lot of slack on the surface. This in turn would create a drop back bite. So then it was down to us to react quickly, pick up the slack line and get into direct contact with the fish as quick as possible and avoid it making any snags. So placing the rods themselves wasn't easy, basically. It's most definitely a team effort. Although by the end of the week, once Alan had left us, I did sort of learn to do it myself, although it was far from easy, but it definitely required 2 people in the boat. With the nature of the river and the fast flow, just holding yourself in place for long enough to be able to position a line clip and then effectively bait up and position a rig was a real challenge for one person alone. And it took a lot of practice, but we improved over the week. And yeah, by the end of it, I wouldn't say we were pros, but we kind of had it down to a fine art as such. It quickly became apparent whose job it was to do what. Alan was far more experienced in terms of positioning the rods and baiting up. He had done a lot more of that side of things. Also with the line clips, I'd never really fished them before. So he sort of adopted that job. I'm pretty comfortable in a boat. I've done a lot of boat fishing in the past. So my job initially was to basically hold us in place. A lot of the time that was done with the oars. A lot of the time that was me holding on to a close by snag or branch. And a lot of the time it was down to me being able to control the engine, you know. It was essential that we had a 65-pound thrust engine. Most of the time this just about kept us stable for long enough. That coupled with the 240 rib with the keel, that allowed us to move through the water significantly easier. And without the right equipment, I fear we just wouldn't have been able to fish effectively. So after we had positioned a rig, the whole process was far from over. The next challenge was trying to manoeuvre ourselves back across the river in as straight a line as possible without causing too much slack in the line, because if that main line touched the water, in effect, it would create tension and pull the line out of the clip. Some of the stretches we were fishing were maybe 40, 50 meters wide at a time. So as you can imagine, it was a military operation as such. Once the rig was positioned, once we had baited up, once the line was in the clip, it was my job to get back across that river as fast as possible, while Alan held the rod as high as possible, keeping the line out of the water so we had a direct line back to the boat. The actual rig we decided to present on these spots was pretty bog standard, really, you know, not a lot different from what we'd fish in the UK. The only big difference was that we had beefed everything up, basically. We kind of split between blowback and slip D rigs, really. However, as opposed to size 6 or 4 hooks that you maybe use in the UK, everything was beefed up. So we went straight in with the size 2 brute hooks, or twister hooks in Alan's case. As opposed to your standard 20 to 25 pound hook links like you'd use back home, we went straight in with the 35 pound armour links. And the actual length of the rig as well, I think that was the big difference. And this was something Alan taught me from his previous experience fishing the rivers. Because of the flow of the river, you've constantly got debris coming down. I'm talking twigs, sticks, weed, etc. And the way we were presenting, if we were to fish normal, say 6 to 8 inch rigs, like you might do with your standard fishing, there was always that chance that this debris would build up on our leads and on our leaders, and there's a chance it could obscure the rig and the hook bait. So Alan's theory was, if we were to increase the length of our rigs, and I mean significantly increase, at times we were fishing maybe rigs of 20, 30 centimetres length, even if this debris did build up, our hook bait would still be free of debris and we'd be fishing at all times. So we were fully aware that the river lot didn't only contain carp. Unfortunately, there's a lot of nuisance species as well, big barbel, big chub, all of which love eating boilies. So it was paramount that we made the effort to ensure that we weren't going to get pestered, because the last thing we didn't want to happen was spending all this time finding a spot, presenting our baits successfully, for then it to be ruined within minutes by a nuisance species. So with that, we had to go in with big baits basically. We had everything with us, don't get me wrong. We had pellets, we had ground baits, we had particle. However, it soon became apparent that we weren't going to be able to use any of this. And as a result of this, we went in purely with 24mm boilies, 20mm boilies and tiger nuts. Obviously this tactic wasn't bulletproof. As I've mentioned, these chub and barbel are big. And we did catch a few. However, using the big hook baits and the big feed bait, it definitely prolonged it slightly, allowing us more chance to catch a carp. So it wasn't only the nuisance species that we had to take into account when baiting up, we also had to consider the flow of the river. Now, as I mentioned previous, the river can rise or drop literally in minutes. If they open a lock or you get a heavy downfall of rain, you could clearly see the difference in the river. The flow would increase, it'd become a different colour, very chocolatey, and all of these things had to be taken into consideration when we were dropping a rod. Thankfully, we had plenty of 24mm and 20mm boilies with us. They just about held their own the majority of the time, and we could confirm this by using the goggles or the underwater camera, and 9 times out of 10, when we would check the spots, the bait was still there. We also had to take into consideration where we would apply the bait. For example, if we were to just drop a rig and then throw a handful of baits over the top, the chances are by the time those baits hit the bottom, they would be 5-10 metres downstream. So depending on the flow, we had to almost guess as such where we would apply our baits, which in most cases ended up being maybe 5 or 10, even 10 metres upstream. Again, through trial and error, we were able to test this, and the underwater camera and the goggles proved that most of the time we were getting it about right. In terms of the rods we used for the session, we swapped over from our standard 3 pound, 3.5 pound test curve rods that you would use in the UK, and we went straight in with 4.5 pound scope abbreviated rods. Just because they've got a lot more power to them, a lot more backbone, and that was vitally important when you're doing battle with these wild carp that live in a river. You know, they're powerful fish, and 9 times out of 10 we were also fishing across the snags or features. And so the second we got that bite, it was important to get those fish away from those snags as quickly as possible. That coupled with the fact that it wasn't just carp in the river, there was also some large catfish. And if you hook one of those like Alan did during the session, you certainly know about it. So yeah, 4.5 pound rods were an absolute must. So when it came down to the main line, mono was stripped from the reel straight away, and we went straight in with 40 pound high line braid. Again, because of the nature of the spots we were fishing, the stretching the mono, we wouldn't have stood a chance, you know. We would have got that bite, and within seconds that fish would have been in a snag with little to no indication. The braid is a lot more stronger, it's a lot more abrasion resistant, and the indication is significantly better. So the second we had any form of indication from the line being removed from the clip, the R4 bite alarms let us know, and we were in direct contact with the fish. Attached to our braided main line, we opted to fish a really strong 70 pound mono snag leader, and several meters of it as well, maybe 3 or 4 turns onto the reel. So there were a couple different reasons why we opted to fish with the strong 70 pound mono snag leader. One, it offers us extra protection down at the business end. And with the abundance of snags, rocks, boulders, etc. we're fishing, it was paramount that we had some form of leader on there. And the second reason why we chose to fish with a mono snag leader as opposed to a braided snag leader is that the mono just offers that little bit of stretch and a little bit of cushion, which helps when playing fish with the heavy gear that we were using. Heavy leads were also essential when positioning a rig. As I mentioned previous, the river can fluctuate so quickly, literally in seconds. So we almost fished heavier leads than we needed to at times, just to compensate for if that river did rise or the flow increased during the night. On average, we were fishing sort of 6 to 8 ounces of lead, and the majority of the time we managed to hold bottom with that. However, there were times throughout the week that we had to increase this from 8 ounces to 10, even 12 ounces at times. When we were lucky enough to get a bite from a carp, it was important that we reacted quickly. Whoever's turn it was on the rod would instantly hit the rod and try and get it away from any snags and into the open water where it's safer to play, basically. The other person's job was to get the boat round to the front of the swim, landing net, etc., life jackets, and we would be out in that boat as quick as possible. Once the fish was relatively safe in the middle of the river, we would steer out to it and land it. The main objective was to get the fish away from any snags and play it in the open water. So to summarise, as challenging as it is to fish a venue like the River Lot, with the correct equipment, working as a team and gaining as much prior knowledge before your session, you too can get yourself out there, have an adventure and make it happen.